Hi guys, welcome back. So in part 1 we finished the data gathering. So we can now choose between the different securities and the information will be rendered below. Now we have to actually give some actions to the buttons. So when we click stock price or indicators, nothing happens. And the idea is to be able to interchangeably click stock price to get the stock price distribution or indicators to get the key indicators about the security. So let's build that. Okay, let's write another callback below the define update data. So let's write app.callback. And this callback is going to target the stock price button. So let's go above. And if we check it, the stock price button has an ID of stock. And the idea is when we click the button, something has to happen. So let's start by define our input, that is that button. So let's write stock. And from the button, we want a property called nClicks. And this property is going to give us the number of times that this button was clicked. Okay. This will trigger our action and we're going to do something with that. So let's also define an output because for each callback there's always an input and an output. And our output is going to be the graph's content. So let's go here, graph's contents, add it here. And we want to output in the children element. Let's just separate this by a comma. And now we have our input and our output. So now let's do something with them. So let's define something like stock price or whatever you want to call it. And the stock price function is going to get like the number of clicks from the stock price button and is going to output something. So let's start by print this value and just return something in the meanwhile, a list. And let's run the dashboard and see what we have. Okay, so when we click stock price, we will output to our terminal some numbers. And these numbers are the number of times that we click the button. So, but you can see that we have a non-value here, right? So where did it come from? So let me show you. Every time that you enter the page, you have the same problem that before. So the first input is none. So we are going to receive the indication that the number of clicks is none, and we're going to call this function. And everything that is inside this function is going to run. And we don't want it because we didn't click the button. So we have to do what we did before, that is like prevent the update. So if the v equals to none, let's raise prevent update. Okay? And now we can print again the v. Whoops. And we can see that it makes more sense. So let's do it again. Let's go back to our dashboard and let's see now. So now we don't have the none value. So when the page reloads, we don't care. So nothing happens. So cool. Now that we have our input, the number of clicks, we are also missing something because the idea will be to draw a graph, to render a graph in our dashboard for the ticker that is currently selected. Okay, so we have to gather this ticker from the drop-down box. So we need another input. So let's write it down. So input, and here we have to get exactly the same input that we have before. So drop-down tickers, and we want the value. So now we have two arguments in inputs. Let's call it v2. And let's print v2 to see if we can get the ticker printed in our console. Let's run it again. Let's choose Apple and let's see if we have, whoops, apple printed, we are not having apple printed. Let's see why. Let's try again. Let's go again, and let's click it. And here we go. We have the ticker. So we are gathering the value from the drop-down box. Okay. So let's do something with this value. We want to take from the Yahoo Finance, so YF. We want to download the stock price distribution, and this method from the Yahoo Finance API library, it's asking us for a ticker. So we already have the value from V2, so let's pass it in, and this should download the data from that given ticker. So let's print the F. Let's try again. When we choose our ticker and then we click the button, we have something back. And this something will be enough to plot the graph. We are going to plot the open price, or the open price. It will be good. So let's now just reset the index, because we want the date not to be the index but to be a column. As you can see, is set by default as an index. So let's just say in place equals to true. Whoops, I don't know how to write. And let's now get a figure, okay? And we need a graph. So we actually have to write the graph and then pass it as an element. So let's do that. Let's create a function up here. And this function will basically output a graph. So let's call it get stock price fig or something like that. And let's get an input as the df that we got it below. And let's start the go figure from Plotly. And that means that we have to import it Plotly because we don't have it imported yet. So let's import Plotly. Whoops. Dot graph objects as go. And this is the old way of plotting graphs with Plotly, but it's also the way that I like the most. So let's stick with it for now. And the first thing is to define our figure. So it's go.figure. And inside our figure, we want to add a trace. And this trace is basically the lines. So inside the add trace, let's write go scatter. Let's define that as lines. So mode equals to lines. And let's pass the data. So we need an X and a Y. Our X is the date. So that's why we resetted the index to have it as a column. And the Y is the close price. Let's take the close price. Now let's return the figure. Okay, now every time we call this function, we're going to have a figure like returned, like a graph. And it's not, I have a typo here, it's stock price. So let's gather like this function here, and let's call it here and pass the df. So let's see what's happening again. So our output is going to be a children element of our div graphs contents, right? And is it here? We're going to output here like a graph. So the next thing that we have to do is actually to return from our callback a graph element. So inside our return, let's do dcc from dashcore components, and let's take a graph. Okay, and inside the graph, the main argument is the figure. So let's write it down, figure, and our figure will be our fig that we got from the previous function. So that should be enough to have like something outputted. So let's try it out. Let's go to our Whoops, yeah. Let's select the ticker. And let's click stock prices. And here we go. We have a graph rendered in our dashboard. It doesn't look nice. Everything is still a bit messy. We are going to tackle that in part 3. But for now, let's just like keep going on the data. And yeah, so we have one of the buttons already doing something. Now we have to do the same for the second button, the indicators. So let's do exactly the same thing and do app.callback. And inside our callback, we need to have, again, an output and an input. And let's start by the input. So our input this time is going to be the indicators. So let's go here, indicators, ID indicators. So let's copy the ID and let's pass it here. And we want from the indicators the exact same thing, the property and clicks for the number of clicks. And in our output, so let's write it down here, output, we want to output it in a different div actually. So in the perfect world, we would also output it to graph contents, and we would just click stock price or indicators, and we would output in the same element. But Dash is not that kind with us. So let's try to do that actually, right? So let's just try to output to the exact same children, and let's just save some time and actually copy the previous function. Let me just pass this down because the run server has to be the last line. Let's create just a dummy function to test why this is not going to work. And let's run it. Okay, so we are missing a comma here, as always. So let's go there and look, we already have a warning. Duplicate callback outputs. So this is one of the biggest problems with this library so far, is that you cannot output in different callbacks. You cannot have the same output in different callbacks. So this is not going to work. So we cannot output into different callbacks. And we forgot the decorator, but that was not the issue here. So to overcome like this small problem, we have to output it to a different element. So it's going to be the parent element. That's why we created something else here. So as you can see, you have the graph's content and you have the main content. Okay? So we're going to output something to the outside div and completely forget this one. So let's start by that. So let's first change the name for indicators. We're going to have two inputs as well, but our output is not going to be the graph contents. It's going to be the main contents. So one element up. Okay, so instead of being here on the graph's contents, we're going to go directly to the main content. Cool. We also need to take the number of clicks that we already have, and I think we're good to go. Let's delete that. That was just one example, show you. And from here, let's start by gathering the data that we need. Okay, so we already have the input as indicators. Yeah, but we are still missing a second input. That is the drop-down value. So let's even copy it from here. Add it here with just one comma. And let's just print it to values to see if everything is fine for now. And return an empty list. Not empty, with an empty string. Okay. So ID not found in the layout, so probably have a typo. Main content, yeah. So we have to delete this S. So let's go there again. Whoops. Okay. So when we click indicators, we have one an apple. So perfect, right? So let's start by gathering the data from the API again. And this time we want to take something different. We want to take the ticker information, and let's write ticker, and from the ticker we write yf.ticker, and let's pass the value from the ticker that we get from the drop-down list. So, and from this ticker we want to take the method info. Okay, so if we print it down, so ticker.info, if we run it again, let's go to our dashboard and let's click indicators. Just wait a bit. Yeah, so now we have like a lot of information here, right? So you guys can customize your dashboard as much as you want. I'm just going to give you some examples. So the first thing to do is to add this data to a data frame. So let's create a data frame. So df intro, and this equals to pd data frame. And from the data frame, we want to get it from a dictionary. That's the information that we get back from the API. So these are like, this is a dictionary. So let's take it, and again, like we did in part 1, we have to pass the orient, and the orient is index, and we want to invert the data frame to have the keys as columns. Now that we have that, let's actually take some columns from it, right? It's too much information inside and we don't want it. So let's just pick like a couple of columns and let's stick with them. In my case, I picked the price to book. I picked the profit margin, the book value, the enterprise to add beta. We just paste it here, and some other columns. I'm just going to paste it here. You guys have the code available in GitHub, and I don't want this to be boring. So let's move on. Now that we have the data, let's actually print it out to see if everything is fine. Okay, let's go to our dashboard, and here we go. Let's click indicators and see what we get back. Nothing. Let's try again. And still nothing, because profit margin not in index. Yep, so it's profit margins. So let's add it here, and that explains the problem. So let's do it again. Indicators, and here we go. So now we have like a small data frame with the key things that we want to render. So now that we have that, the next step is actually to build the KPIs. So let's start by creating an element to be outputted here, and let's call it something like KPI data. And the KPI data, it's going to start by an HTML div, and inside this HTML div I want to have like more divs. So let's create another HTML.div, and inside this HTML div we're going to have more elements. Okay, just bear with me, this is going to be important to the page design. So let's add inside this HTML div an h4, an header, and this header is going to have like a title of price to book, and it's going to have a p tag of df info. So here we are passing the data, so df info, and we want to take the price to book value. here inside. Okay, so this is the first div, and we are going basically to replicate this div 2 more times. So let's add a comma here, comma, comma. And inside this one, we're going to have enterprise to add beta. And this is enterprise to add beta. And the final one is just the beta. And we're taking the beta here. Okay. And that's basically enough. We just want to give it like a class name here of KPI. And that's good enough. So my apologies, I think not here, because this is the outside div and we want to pass it here in this one. Or no, actually we don't. We want to pass it here. Yeah, so we were right from the beginning. Now that we have that, we still have to output our donut graphs, right? And that means that actually we need another HTML div. And our HTML div, it's going to have everything that we wrote here, plus our donuts elements, our graphs. So let's write these graphs down. Let's write it here. And we need another HTML div for that. So let's get it written. And inside this HTML div, we want to have DCC graphs. So one graph. And inside this graph, we want to have a figure like we had before. But we want to have like a donut graph, so we need to create a different function to have this graph done. So let's go again like up, and let's write something like define get donuts, and let's pass like a df and something like a label to identify the donut. So here I was just like making up some data to have these graphs working fine. So let's just do something like the graphs needs more than one value, and the values that we are picking here are not like the best for donut graphs. You guys can find better values, like you have so many options on the API available, but here I'm just subtracting from the main value. So if we have a margin, I'm going to give like a percentage to the margin that the company is using, and then 1 minus this margin to output the rest of the donut. So let's follow that, and let's do it like non-main equals 1 minus the value that is going to come from here, like the margin. And the labels also very random, so let's just call it main, and let's call it label. Okay, so we have two values, so we need two labels. So main label. And let's give it some values, and the values, it's going to be the non-main and the df values. Whoops. Okay, we can get it like that. And finally, our figure is going to be just another Go figure. And this is a capitalized F, I think, yeah. And let's pass the data. The data is going to have go.py. So it's a pie chart. And we're going to pass the labels and the values. Also, like we want the donut to be a bit thinner, so we're going to have a bigger hole. So let's add it as 4.99. It was the value that I was experimenting, and it looks actually good. So let's also return the figure. And here we go. We have like a nice way to build some donuts. Not real donuts, but you know, some graphs. So let's go ahead and actually pass the figure here. Figure equals to get donut. and we're going to pass for the first donut like the profit margin that we got above. So profit margin, and we are going to give it a label of margin or margins. And the second one, it's going to be the payout. So let's write payout ratio that is capitalized like that. So let's just copy it. Let's be lazy, and let's give it label of payout. Everything seems fine. We just have to give it like a class name to help with the designs for later. And the class name is going to be donuts. Yeah. Okay, cool. So now we have to return something. So let's return our entire thing, the KPI data, inside of the div. So let's do html.div, and inside this div we want to pass our table or our KPI data, and we want to have like some ID. So graphs content. And why are we passing the exact same ID that we are using on the stock price? So we are passing this ID, and let me actually copy it from here. Because if we don't pass this ID, when we click again on the stock price, it's going to look for the main graph's content, and this element will not be in the DOM. So the dashboard will, okay, but this output doesn't exist. What do I do, right? So since we are doing this workaround to avoid the duplication of outputs, we have to pass like another element called graphs contents, okay? And this will be crucial to make everything work. Okay, let's see what we have so far. Let's do python dashboard.py, and of course this div has to be here. Let's do it again. See what we have. And when we choose like a ticker and we click indicators after a while, yeah, now we have a callback error, that is, there's no beta, what are you doing? So because beta is not like capitalized, as you can see here, and I'm passing it here like capitalized. So we can write beta here, but let's try it now again. Let's take Apple, classic one, indicators, and what is there now? The f values is not defined. So this is here. Of course, it's not the f values, it's the f dot values. Okay, let's give it another go. Let's add the dashboard here. Click indicators. Now everything should be fine, or not. So okay, so another typo because it's not values, values. Today is the typos day. So let's try again for the 10th time. And now I promise it will be fine. So let's do it again. And here we go. So we now have like price to book, enterprise to EBITDA, beta, and we have some nice graphs. They don't make much sense, these graphs, because you can have like negative payouts, and but they look good. You guys can customize them. This is just like purely to show you like how to output figures and everything else. Okay, so let's keep going. We're almost done. So now that we have the main things already built, we still have some problems. Because look, let me open it again. So if we choose Apple, and after everything is outputted, and if we click stock prices, and then indicators, and then, you see, like, let's do it again. Let's go to stock prices and indicators. The graph renders again. So we have an issue here. That is that every time that we output it, like the indicators, these graph contents is going to actually activate the callback for the stock price. And we don't want it because it's not going to stick there. So we need to do, as always, some other workarounds because working with Dash is all about workarounds. So let's do it now. The first thing that we have to do is on the indicators callback, we have to pass a different output. So let's add it here inside output. And its output is going to be the stock, so the button itself and the number of clicks. So we have to reset the number of clicks every time that we click on the indicators. And this is actually very simple. So we just have to go here, and when we are returning, let's just return none. Okay? And this will be helpful. Like if we run it again, and if we see like what happens when we click Apple, then stock prices, then indicators again. Now they stick, they don't change because it doesn't recognize as the stock price having like a value. So let's go into that. So what was happening? If we look into our stock price callback, so our input is the number of clicks, okay? But is also the drop down ticker. And when we actually click indicators, we are checking what is the number of clicks on the stock, and it's not none, right? So we are actually updating it again. So the idea is to reset it to none to prevent the update, meaning that we are going to stick with our main indicators graphs. And that's basically it, guys. I think we did it. Like we have the main data part built, and we can now go for the third part on the styling. So thank you and see you there.